Mark Harlow sat in the cold with his loyal dog, Atlas, when he found a letter saying he'd inherited a forgotten cabin deep in the Stillwater woods. The county called it worthless, abandoned, not worth the road leading to it. But when Mark unlocked its dusty door, he didn't find gold or treasure. He found a secret his aunt had prepared for him, one that would give him back everything he'd lost: faith, peace, and the strength to begin again. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. The wind cut through the narrow streets of Billings, Montana, carrying the sharp scent of snow and distant smoke. The city looked pale under the gray dawn, abandoned cars glazed with frost, lampposts leaning like tired sentinels. Beneath one of them sat Mark Harlow, wrapped in an army green coat too thin for the cold. Once a U.S. Marine, now a drifter, he'd traded desert heat for winter's bite. His beard was uneven, streaked with gray, that made him look older than his 43 years. There was a stillness in his eyes, not emptiness, but the quiet fatigue of a man who had seen too much and understood too well how fragile people could be. Beside him lay Atlas, a black and white German shepherd, broad-shouldered, eyes the color of amber sap. The dog was 7 years old, once trained for bomb detection in the field. His left ear bore a small scar, a curved tear from an explosion years ago, and whenever loud noises echoed through the city, Atlas would flinch, pressing close to Mark's leg. They were each other's last constant. Together, they moved like shadows, invisible to the world that had long since moved on. That morning, Mark woke to the crunch of boots on snow. A woman in a red scarf, Sarah, was handing out coffee and bread near the church steps. Sarah was in her late 30s, tall, freckled, with soft brown hair tucked beneath a knitted cap. Her coat was worn at the sleeves, but her eyes were alive, bright with purpose. She worked for a local shelter known for arguing with city officials who wanted the homeless cleaned up before tourists arrived. "You two okay?" she asked gently, setting a cup of hot coffee before him. Mark nodded, but didn't meet her gaze. He wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with questions. Sarah stayed a moment longer, watching Atlas lift his head cautiously before accepting a small piece of bread from her hand. "He's beautiful," she said. "What's his name?" "Atlas," Mark murmured. She smiled. "Fitting. He looks like he's carrying the whole world." Then she left, her red scarf fluttering through the snow. Mark watched her disappear, feeling an odd ache, an echo of the life he once had, the one that felt too far gone to reclaim. The rest of the day passed in a blur of gray light and biting wind. Mark walked the alleys, collecting discarded cans to trade for a few coins. Every sound of boots or car doors made Atlas twitch. Once a police officer glanced at them, but said nothing, just another nameless veteran and his dog. That evening, Mark huddled beneath a loading dock, Atlas curled tightly beside him. He reached into his coat for the small notebook he used to sketch, a habit left over from the war. His hands were raw and shaking. That's when his fingers brushed something unusual, a folded envelope, yellowed and creased, wedged deep in the inside pocket. He frowned. He didn't remember putting it there. The handwriting on the front was looping and neat. To Mr. Mark Harlow. Private. The return address bore the seal of Stillwater County Office. He hesitated, wondering if it was some debt notice, another reminder that the past wasn't done collecting from him. Atlas tilted his head as if sensing the shift in Mark's heartbeat. With a sigh, Mark tore it open. Inside was a single page. The letter informed him that Ruth Harlow, his late aunt, had passed away and named him sole heir to her property, a small wooden house on the outskirts of Stillwater. The words "no market value" and "structural concerns" stood out in cold black ink. Yet, as he read, Mark felt something stir inside him, fragile but unmistakable. Hope? He remembered Ruth only faintly, a quiet woman who used to send Christmas cards to his father, cards that always smelled faintly of lavender. His father had never spoken much about her, just said she'd chosen her solitude. Mark folded the letter carefully, as if it might dissolve if handled too roughly. His heart pounded with a strange mixture of disbelief and longing. A roof, even a broken one, meant warmth, meant rest. He thought of the endless nights under bridges, the cold concrete pressing into his back, and the way Atlas would shiver despite his thick coat. "A house, huh?" he murmured, rubbing the dog's neck. "Guess it's time to go see what ghosts she left behind." That night, as the snow thickened, Mark sat awake for a long time watching flakes drift past the flickering streetlight. For the first time in years, the horizon didn't look like an ending. It looked like a direction. Atlas lay beside him, head on his boots, eyes half closed but alert. Mark reached down, scratching behind his ear. "We're going north, boy," he whispered. "Maybe this time. Maybe this time it's not just another dead end." And so, beneath the quiet sky of Montana, a man who had lost everything gathered what little he owned, a battered duffel, a loyal dog, and a letter that smelled faintly of lavender, and began to believe for the first time in a long time that maybe the universe hadn't forgotten him after all. Snow still clung to the tires of Mark's rusted pickup as he turned off the main road and onto a path barely visible beneath the white drift. The letter from Stillwater's county office lay folded on the passenger seat, smudged and soft from being read too many times. Atlas sat in the back, his nose pressed against the glass, breath fogging the window. The forest grew denser the farther they went, pine trees rising like ancient pillars, their branches heavy with snow. The world here seemed untouched by time, silent except for the steady hum of the engine. When the house finally appeared between the trees, Mark almost missed it. It was smaller than he expected, a weather-beaten wooden cabin slumped against the hillside. The roof sagged in the middle, patched with metal sheets that glinted faintly under the gray daylight. The windows were fogged and cracked, the porch half collapsed beneath years of neglect. Yet for all its ruin, it had presence, a kind of weary dignity, as if it had endured too many winters to be dismissed as worthless. Mark parked, stepped out, and felt the ground sink slightly beneath his boots. Atlas bounded ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging cautiously as if testing whether this forgotten place meant safety or sorrow. Inside, the air was thick with dust and cold, carrying the faint scent of cedar and rusted iron. Mark opened the curtains. A weak beam of sunlight revealed warped floorboards and furniture draped in faded sheets. There was a fireplace of stone, blackened with soot, and a single armchair still facing it, as if someone had just stood up and never returned. On the mantel, a photograph rested in a cracked frame. A woman in her 40s, dark hair pinned neatly, uniform collar visible beneath a heavy wool coat. Ruth Harlow, his aunt. The same eyes as his father's, but softer, burdened by something unspoken. Mark's chest tightened. He whispered a quiet greeting, uncertain to whom he was speaking. The photograph, the walls, or the ghost of a woman who'd planned for a nephew she never met. As the day faded, Mark gathered what little dry wood he could find and coaxed a fire to life. Atlas lay curled near the warmth, sighing contentedly for the first time in days. Mark spread his blanket on the floor beside the hearth, too tired to think, too cold to sleep. The wind outside rose to a low howl, brushing against the cabin's thin walls. At one point, Atlas lifted his head, ears pricked toward the door. Mark heard it too, a faint crunching of snow, deliberate footsteps that stopped just beyond the porch. He stood slowly, heart thudding. The sound faded. Only the forest answered. He waited several minutes before convincing himself it was just the wind, but he kept the fire burning higher until dawn. The next morning, the world outside had softened under a new layer of snow. While chopping firewood behind the cabin, Mark noticed a figure approaching from the tree line, an old man in a thick wool coat and fur, hat leaning on a cane but moving with surprising steadiness. George Wilkins, he introduced himself, voice gravelly but kind. He was in his late 60s, his face leathery from decades of Montana winters, beard silver and unkempt. His right hand trembled slightly, the result of a logging accident long ago, though he joked about it with easy self-deprecation. George had lived a mile east since before color TV, as he put it, and had known Ruth Harlow for most of her life. "She was a stubborn one," he said, glancing toward the house. "Didn't talk much after her brother left for the city. Spent her years tending to people, patching up wounds, never asked for help herself." He paused, eyes distant. "You've got her look, boy. Same jaw, same quiet behind the eyes." Mark listened, uncertain how to respond. He felt both pride and guilt, pride to be tied to someone remembered with respect, guilt for knowing almost nothing about her. George stayed a while, helping Mark patch a loose section of the porch roof. Despite his age, he moved with the rhythm of someone who'd built and rebuilt his life many times. Before leaving, he turned and said, "She used to talk about you, you know. Said you'd find your way here someday. Guess she was right." Then he trudged off into the woods, leaving Mark standing in the pale afternoon light, a single thought circling in his mind. Why had Ruth waited for him? That night, as the temperature fell and the fire crackled low, Mark sat on the cabin floor beside Atlas, the letter and photograph spread out before him. The house groaned softly in the wind, but beneath its decay he could almost feel a heartbeat, a quiet promise that there were still secrets buried under its frozen silence, waiting for him to listen. The thaw came slowly to Stillwater. The snow receded into the moss and soil, leaving behind damp earth that clung to Mark's boots as he worked outside the cabin. He had started repairing the front porch, using old boards he found in the shed behind the house, wood warped and darkened with age, nails bent and rusted, but still usable. Each strike of the hammer echoed into the stillness of the forest. Atlas lay nearby, half asleep in a patch of pale sunlight, occasionally lifting his head when Mark cursed under his breath at a stubborn plank. The cabin was beginning to change, little by little, as if waking from a long, cold dream. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Mark had cleared out the worst of the dust, revealing furniture that, while battered, held traces of a life once lived with care. The kitchen still had an enamel stove with chipped corners. The old dining table bore faint knife marks and coffee stains. As he worked, Mark often caught himself wondering what kind of woman Ruth had been, whether she laughed easily, whether she'd chosen solitude, or been forced into it. The photograph on the mantel had become a silent witness to his every thought. That evening, he decided to explore the small storage room attached to the back of the cabin. The door stuck halfway, swollen from years of moisture. When he finally pried it open, a rush of cold air met him, thick with the scent of rust and old oil. Inside, there were shelves of tools, axes, paint cans, broken lanterns, and against the far wall, an antique trunk covered in cobwebs. He knelt beside it, brushing away dust until his fingers found the latch. Inside lay ordinary things: folded blankets, a pair of leather gloves, a sewing kit, and at the bottom a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with twine. Every envelope was addressed in the same looping handwriting: Thomas Harlow, his father. Mark's breath caught. He took one envelope and sat on the floor beside Atlas, who had followed him and now rested his chin on Mark's knee. The paper was brittle but intact. He unfolded the letter carefully. The ink faded, but legible. It began simply, "Dear Thomas, if you are reading this, it means the time for explanations has come." Ruth's words were filled with longing and apology. She spoke of choices made during the war, of a promise she had kept for their father, to protect something of great value, something hidden to ensure it could not be taken by those who once sought it. She never said what it was, only that it belonged to the family and must remain safe until the right Harlow returns. The letter ended without closure, as if interrupted mid-thought. Mark stared at the page, his throat tightening. His father had never mentioned Ruth except to say she'd gone her own way. He died 10 years ago, bitter and quiet, carrying secrets Mark never understood. Now those secrets were clawing their way back through time. A knock startled him, a faint, deliberate tap against the front door. Atlas jumped to his feet, growling softly. Mark rose slowly, the letter still in his hand. When he opened the door, the night was silent, except for the whisper of wind through the trees. No footprints marked the snow. Only a small tin box sat on the porch, the metal dull and cold. Inside it lay a photograph. Ruth in a nurse's uniform, standing beside a man Mark recognized from an old family photo. His father, younger, smiling. Beneath it was a folded note in the same careful handwriting. "You're closer than you think." Mark stood there for a long moment, heart hammering, the forest pressing in around him. Atlas nosed the box, whined softly, then looked up as if waiting for direction. "We'll find out, boy," Mark whispered. "Whatever she wanted me to see, we'll find it." He carried the box inside and set it beside the fire. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the faint creak of trees and, for a moment, something that almost sounded like a sigh. The snow along the dirt road had turned to slush, crunching under Mark's boots as he made his way into Stillwater's main street. The town was small, 2 intersecting roads lined with weathered wooden buildings, their paint fading into the same muted palette as the hills beyond. A faded sign above the general store read, "Carter's Postal and Supply," letters chipped but still proud. Atlas trotted beside him, tail low, sniffing every post along the way. It had been a week since he'd found the tin box, and the mystery inside the letter had gnawed at him with every sleepless night. He needed answers, and if anyone in this forgotten town knew Ruth Harlow, it would be the woman who had once carried her mail. Inside the post office, the air was warmer than expected, thick with the scent of old paper and coffee. Behind the counter stood Emily Carter, a woman in her mid-40s, tall and slender, her auburn hair pinned back loosely under a wool beret. Her gray eyes carried both kindness and fatigue, the kind that came from losing too much, yet choosing to stay gentle. She wore a dark green cardigan that matched the calm steadiness in her voice. The silver band still on her finger hinted at a loss that had never healed. Her husband, Daniel, a volunteer firefighter, had died 5 winters ago, saving a neighbor's barn. Since then, Emily had run the post office alone, helping townsfolk with everything from taxes to lost packages. Mark introduced himself quietly. When he mentioned Ruth's name, Emily's expression softened with recognition. "Ruth Harlow," she repeated, almost to herself. "I used to deliver to her every Thursday, never let me in, but she'd wait by the door. Always had a jar of honey for my trouble." She paused, studying Mark's face. "You've got her eyes, thoughtful, a little sad." He handed her the letter he'd found and asked if she could help him trace its references. Emily read it carefully, her brow furrowing. "These seals are old," she murmured. "Looks like legal correspondence tied to property rights. I might still have the registry records. Ruth's file would have been transferred to the county archives after she passed." She disappeared into the back room, leaving Mark and Atlas waiting among shelves stacked with yellow envelopes and dusty ledgers. After several minutes, Emily returned with a manila folder marked Harlow, Ruth M. Inside were copies of land records, letters from a company called Northern Grid Energy, and an old map of the property lines. "Here," she said, pointing to a faint red line cutting through Ruth's acreage. "That's an underground cable route. Northern Grid installed it back in 1985. Ruth signed a maintenance agreement for access rights. Smart deal, if you ask me. Most folks would have sold the land cheap, but she negotiated to keep ownership. Mark frowned. Does the contract still exist? Emily nodded. If it's still active, the payments might still be due. You'd have to check with the county clerk, but I've seen cases like this before. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. Ruth wasn't poor, you know. She just lived simple, maybe too simple for people to notice. Mark thanked her, feeling the weight of gratitude he didn't know how to express. Before leaving, Emily knelt to scratch Atlas behind the ears. "He's loyal," she said softly. "That's a rare thing these days." Atlas leaned into her hand, tail thumping lightly against the floor. That afternoon, the clouds broke open with sleet as Mark and Atlas returned home. The forest seemed darker now, branches heavy with ice. Behind the cabin, Atlas barked suddenly, running toward the back wall. Mark followed to find the dog pawing at a patch of rotting planks half buried in snow. Beneath them was a narrow opening, a breath of cold air rising from within. Kneeling, Mark cleared away the debris until the outline of a small underground passage appeared, its entrance hidden behind vines and old timber. The air smelled of earth and metal. With a lantern in hand, he crawled down the narrow steps, Atlas following close behind. The space beneath the cabin was small and damp, lined with stone. At the far end, half covered by dirt, lay a metal safe wrapped in oilcloth, the surface scarred with age. Mark's pulse quickened. He brushed the grime away and lifted it carefully onto a flat stone slab. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, were documents, ledgers, and a thick book of savings certificates dated decades back, all under Ruth's name. The edges of the paper were fragile, but the ink remained sharp. She'd preserved them deliberately, protected from time itself. Mark sat there in the lantern glow, Atlas resting beside him, listening to the faint hum of the forest above. "You were keeping something alive," he whispered to the darkness. "And now it's mine to finish." The morning sun crept over Stillwater's valley, melting the last shards of frost that clung to the wooden fences. Mark drove the old pickup into town, the documents and savings ledgers wrapped neatly in the same oilcloth Ruth had once used to protect them. The hum of the engine filled the silence, and Atlas, sitting tall in the passenger seat, kept his eyes fixed on the passing trees as if he understood the gravity of their errand. Every mile toward town felt heavier, as though the ghosts of Ruth's careful choices followed close behind. The county office sat on Main Street, a square brick building with faded blue shutters and the faint smell of old coffee wafting from within. Mark stepped through the door, greeted by the creak of polished floors and a wall of filing cabinets older than himself. Behind the counter sat Mr. Harold Patterson, a man who looked as though he had been carved from the same oak that framed the building. In his late 60s, he had a long, lined face and a neatly trimmed gray mustache. His blue eyes were sharp yet kind, set behind rimless spectacles. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though each gesture carried the weight of decades spent balancing numbers and names. He'd worked for the county since his 20s and had become something of a local historian, someone who remembered every deed, every scandal, every story whispered across Stillwater. "Morning," Patterson greeted, glancing at the documents in Mark's hand. "You must be Ruth's nephew. Emily Carter called ahead. Said you found something worth dusting off." His voice carried a rough warmth, like gravel underfoot. Mark nodded, placing the stack of papers on the counter. Patterson adjusted his glasses, leafing through the faded contracts and savings certificates. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "She really kept everything." For the next half hour, the room filled with the sound of turning pages and the soft whir of an ancient ceiling fan. Patterson eventually looked up, tapping one document with his pen. "This here, Northern Grid Energy, 1985. She signed an easement, giving them rights to run underground cables across her land. The agreement renewed automatically every 20 years, indexed for inflation. He flipped another page, doing quick mental math. That's about $9,000, maybe a little more each year. Payments have been going into an escrow account since 2006. She must have instructed the company to hold them. Mark frowned. Why wouldn't she take the money? She lived like she had nothing. Patterson leaned back, the chair groaning softly. She told me once, he said, eyes distant, that she was saving it for the right person. Said it wasn't her time to use it, that the house would find its purpose when someone needed it most. He paused, studying Mark's face with quiet recognition. I think she meant you. The words landed heavier than Mark expected. He'd come seeking information, but what he found felt closer to grace. Ruth hadn't just left him a house, she'd left him a lifeline built on patience and faith. For the first time, the idea of home felt real, not a memory, not a dream, but something earned through the love of someone he barely knew. Patterson handed him a thin envelope. Take this to the Northern Grid Regional Office in Billings. They'll release the funds into your account after verification. You'll need an ID, but that shouldn't be an issue. He smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes wrinkling. You might just find this old town a bit warmer now that you've got roots here. As Mark walked back to his truck, the air outside felt different, cleaner, lighter. The wind carried the scent of pine and thawing soil. Atlas wagged his tail, pressing close against his leg as if sensing his relief. Mark looked toward the mountains, the horizon shimmering under pale sunlight. He whispered, half to himself, half to the spirit of his aunt. You waited for me, didn't you? You knew I'd come when I had nothing left. Atlas barked once, sharp and bright, echoing against the hills. It sounded almost like an answer. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk was rolling down the valley. Mark lit the fireplace and placed the oilcloth bundle on the table. He stared at the flames dancing across the stone hearth and felt something shift inside him, a stillness, a quiet assurance. The house wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a promise fulfilled. By the time March arrived, the snow had surrendered to muddy earth, and the valley began to breathe again. The air smelled of pine resin and thawed soil. Mark stood in the backyard of the old cabin, the wind teasing at his flannel sleeves, watching as Atlas trotted through patches of half-frozen grass. The money from Northern Grid had finally reached his account, and for the first time in years, he had enough to do more than just survive. The roof no longer leaked. The rusted stove in the kitchen had been replaced with a sturdy cast-iron one he'd bought from a local farmer. He had insulation installed, new window panes fitted, and the old chimney cleaned. The house, once silent and shivering in the cold, now exhaled warmth. Atlas had taken to following Mark everywhere, into the woods, across fields, even down to the creek behind the property. He was getting older. The gray on his muzzle was beginning to show, but his eyes were still bright with loyalty. Sometimes, when Mark paused to rest, Atlas would dig near the garden plot, unearthing small, forgotten things, rusted tools, a broken teacup, and once a packet of seeds wrapped in wax paper. The label, faded but legible, read sunflowers. It reminded Mark of Emily Carter, who often spoke about how her late husband had planted them every spring, believing they brought good luck. That week, Emily visited the cabin for the first time. She came carrying a basket filled with seeds and a tin of cookies, her auburn hair tied back with a ribbon, cheeks flushed pink from the walk up the hill. "You've done more with this place in 2 months than Ruth did in 10 years?" she teased lightly. Mark smiled, something he didn't do often. "She built the foundation. I'm just keeping it alive." They spent the afternoon planting rows of flowers along the fence line. Emily worked quietly, her fingers nimble and sure, and every so often she glanced toward the forest as if listening to something only she could hear. There was a steadiness in her, a kind of peace born from surviving pain without letting it turn her bitter. Before leaving, she looked around the garden and said softly, "You'll hear them grow when the wind's right." Ruth used to say that. The following days brought more visits from neighbors. George Wilkins showed up with a chainsaw older than both of them combined, insisting it still bit wood like a hungry bear. Together they cleared the fallen branches that cluttered the yard. Clara Jenkins, a stout woman in her 50s who ran the local diner, stopped by with homemade stew and a promise to spread word that Mark could fix just about anything that breaks. Word spread fast in Stillwater. Soon he was patching fences, repairing chimneys, and mending old barns in exchange for groceries, eggs, or sometimes just company. As the garden began to sprout and the house hummed with quiet activity, the townsfolk's curiosity about the reclusive veteran turned to respect. Mark noticed the change in their faces, the wary glances replaced by nods of greeting, even smiles. He had become part of the rhythm of Stillwater, his presence woven into its days like the steady ticking of a clock. Every evening, as the sky turned lavender and smoke curled from the chimney, the lights from the cabin glowed through the forest, a small, steadfast heartbeat of warmth. That night, sitting on the porch with Atlas lying at his feet, Mark looked out over the land that had once felt haunted. Fireflies flickered over the field where the sunflowers would bloom, and he felt a peace that didn't demand understanding. "You were right, Ruth," he murmured into the quiet. "It just needed someone to listen." Atlas raised his head, ears twitching, before resting it back down with a soft sigh. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying the faint scent of new growth. For the first time in years, Mark didn't feel like a man running from the past. He felt like someone building toward the future. 3 years slipped quietly through Stillwater, marked not by grand events, but by the steady rhythm of ordinary days. The cabin that once groaned under snow and silence now smelled of cedar shavings and varnish. Mark's small woodworking shop occupied what had been the old storage room, its windows open to the forest. The sound of a saw hummed beneath the soft chorus of birds outside. He had paid off every debt, not through miracles, but through patient work and the trust of the townsfolk who now brought him chairs to mend, tables to refinish, and stories to share. Atlas, once a sentinel of restless energy, had grown slower. His muzzle was nearly white, his steps deliberate, yet his spirit had lost none of its quiet pride. Every morning he lay by the porch, watching the sunrise through the trees, ears twitching to the familiar sounds of the valley. Sometimes his head would rest on his paws as Mark worked nearby, the old rhythm of companionship unbroken even by time. When children from the town passed on their way to school, they often stopped to pet him. He would lift his head just enough to wag his tail, his amber eyes calm and wise. One warm afternoon, Mark was sanding a set of oak shelves when he saw a dusty white van stop at his gate. From it stepped Mr. Lewis Carter, a field representative from Northern Grid Energy. He was in his early 50s, compact and efficient, his short-cropped blonde hair flecked with gray. A sharp dresser for a man who spent most of his time on the road, he wore a tan blazer over jeans and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent decades talking to landowners about contracts. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and an apologetic smile. "Mr. Harlow, I'm here about your easement agreement. Seems your late aunt negotiated a deal far better than anyone realized." Inside the cabin, over coffee that Mark insisted on brewing, Lewis laid out a folder. "The company wants to renew for another 20-year term," he explained, "and given inflation and usage, they're offering nearly double the current rate, $18,000 annually, indexed. All you need is a signature." Mark stared at the papers, the numbers swimming slightly in his vision. He couldn't help but laugh softly. "She really planned this," he said. "Even when she was gone, she found a way to keep this place alive." Lewis smiled, packing his things neatly. I didn't know your aunt personally, but I've seen hundreds of contracts. None written with that kind of foresight. She must have loved this land deeply. When the van disappeared down the road, Mark stepped outside. The evening light spilled over the treetops, turning the cabin's roof to gold. Atlas was there, lying in his usual spot, eyes half closed. Mark sat beside him, one hand resting on the dog's back. The forest hummed with the sounds of life, returning for the night. Crickets, the rustle of wind through pine, the distant call of an owl. "You did good, boy," Mark said quietly. "We both did." Atlas exhaled a slow, contented breath. Mark lifted his gaze to the horizon where the sun bled into the line of mountains. "Ruth," he whispered, "you really did think farther than any of us." And as the sky deepened to amber and violet, the lights inside the cabin flickered on, one by one, glowing against the encroaching dusk. It wasn't wealth he felt, it was peace, the kind that comes only when a man learns that redemption sometimes looks like a small house, a loyal friend, and the long quiet of a life rebuilt. In the end, Mark's story isn't about luck or wealth, it's about the quiet miracles God plants in our ordinary lives. Sometimes His blessings don't arrive wrapped in gold, but in second chances, loyal hearts, and the courage to rebuild. Just as Mark found hope in an old house and an aging dog, may you also find grace in the small corners of your own life, a smile, a sunrise, a moment of peace. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel, and let's keep spreading faith and kindness together. May God bless you, guide your steps, and remind you, miracles still happen, often when we least expect them.